Please do continue to pray for that in the weeks ahead. Ruth chapter 4. If you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and turn there. We are landing the plane on a teaching series we've been in for the last 4 weeks. This is week 5. And I want to start out with this question. Have you ever thought, when you were looking at someone else's life, have you ever had the thought, man, I want what they have. I want the life that they've got, the things they have, the opportunities that they have. When you see their life, you think, man, I like that. I want that. Maybe it's their friends. You look at their friend group and you just see, like, it just seems like they've got hundreds of friends and everybody likes them and they're just fun to be around. And when they post things on social media, you're like, man, they're just always having a good time with a lot of really good people. And you look at that and you think, man, I want that. I'd like to have that in my life. Or maybe you look at their career and you think, man, they're really successful. They actually use the degree that they paid all that money for. And maybe you have the same degree that they have, and you're like, man, I wish I could use my degree, but that opportunity just hasn't presented itself. And so you look at them and you think, man, that's great for them, and I wish that was true for me. Or you look at the impact that they're making in the lives of those around them and the opportunities they have to be involved in ministry and to make a difference. And you think, man, that's inspiring. I want to be like that. Or you look at the family dynamic that they're in. You look at their family and it's just like, it just seems so tidy and neat. Everything's good. Like, their family pictures are perfect. Everybody's matching, looks great. There's not a hair out of place. The dog even looks good. And you're like, man, the one time we tried to take family pictures, it almost ended in the loss of life and a divorce. And I look at them and it just seems like it's all together. Or you look at the sports teams they root for, and you're like, man, why didn't I choose to root for the teams they root for? Because their teams always win, and mine always lead to disappointment. Or whatever it is, it's really easy to look at other people's lives and think, man, I want that. And honestly, social media fuels this, because we really only see what people want us to see. And so what we actually see is the billboard, not the diary, not the journal. We see the highlights, the highlight reel of people's lives, and we start to look at it, and we start to compare things in our lives. We start to think, I want that. The problem is that we only see the current chapter. We don't see everything that happened before that. We don't see the struggle. We don't see the battle with insecurity, or the heartbreaking loss, or the anxiety that they had to overcome to get to where they were, or the opportunities or the circumstances going on in their life where God had to prove himself faithful so that they could experience what they're experiencing now. We don't see all of that. We only see what is visible and obvious to everybody. So what I want to do today, as we jump into this last chapter of Ruth, is I want us to think about, what does a new chapter look like for us? What does a new chapter look like for you? And as you're turning to Ruth chapter 4, if you're already there, let me say this, and then we'll kind of recap. But I think this is true. The decisions that you make today will determine the story you tell tomorrow. The decisions that you make today will determine the story that you will tell tomorrow. That's true for all of us. And my prayer, as I've been preparing for today and as I've been thinking about this, is that we would not just continue to repeat the same cycle, to stay stuck in the current chapter that we're in, one that we're frustrated with, one that we are disappointed in, one that's been incredibly difficult. Because I do believe there's a better story for you, but we have a role to play in that as we trust God. And I think we see some of this in Ruth chapter 4. A really quick recap, if you've been here or if you've missed the last several weeks, we started in chapter 1 and we read about Elimelech. I always get tied up trying to say his name. Elimelech and his family, his wife Naomi, and their 2 boys moved to Moab. They left Bethlehem. They get there and both boys and Elimelech die. They pass away. And so then it's just Naomi and her 2 daughter-in-laws. Naomi makes a decision to return to Bethlehem after 10 years, and not both, but one of the daughters, Ruth, decides to go with her. Ruth was a Moabite. She was from Moab. And Moab was a really dark place. It wasn't a place that God wanted his people to be. And they had spent all this time there, but she decides she's going to stay loyal to Naomi, and she wants to stay loyal to Naomi's God and get to know Naomi's God. So they go back to Bethlehem. They get there. Chapter 2 rolls in. Ruth is out gleaning in the fields, looking for food for her and Naomi, trying to provide. And along comes this man named Boaz, and the music begins to change. And there's this romance vibe that we begin to pick up, and they begin to have some conversation, maybe even went out on a date. Sparks begin to fly. Maybe there's something special to this. She goes home, she tells Naomi, and And Boaz just kind of ghosts her, just doesn't ever, we don't know of anything that goes on. And for, I think, about 7 weeks, there's 7 weeks of harvest that go by. And then we know that Ruth comes up with a plan, and she goes to Boaz and she sleeps at the foot of his bed. She sleeps at his feet one night, and he wakes up and he finds her. And she's like, hey, remember me? Really awkward, weird scene that we read about, but we learned about. And I'm not going to go back into all that today, but you can go back and listen to last week on any of those on the podcast or YouTube. But this is where we find ourselves. She's gone and she's made this proposal to Boaz. She's asking him to be her guardian redeemer. And he agrees to it. But there's a hang up. There's a problem. There's someone else who actually is first in line to become her guardian redeemer, the one that is going to commit to providing for her, to protect her, to marry her, to help her have children. And it's not Boaz. And because Boaz is a man of standing, he's a man of character, as we've been talking about, he comes up with a plan. He said, this is what we're going to do, and we'll do this if this is the right thing to do. And so that's where we're at in chapter 4. So let's pick it up. Verse 1 says this. It says, now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. Maybe underline that, highlight that. I'm going to tell you to underline some things as we read through this, but I want to read through this entire text and then we'll make some sense of it. So he's sitting at the city gate. This is an important place. This is an important place for negotiation, for business deals. This is where Boaz is hanging out. And then it just so happens that the guy he was talking about, that's first in line, according to the law of the people that were living in that day, he just happens to walk by. It says, as he was passing by, so he said, come over here, friend, sit down here. And he came over and he sat down. Then he took 10 men of the elders of the city and he said, sit down here. So they sat. A little bossy, Boaz is. And he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has returned from the land of Moab, has to sell the plot of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought that I would inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it. But if not, tell me so that I may know. For there is no one except you to redeem it, and I am after you. He's working in accordance to law. He's working in a way that shows integrity and honor for the system that is in place. And he said, I will redeem it. So this man says, okay, sounds like a good deal. I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, there's a catch. You must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. You heard me talk about that last week, how big of a deal it was to have a child and specifically to have a son. This was something that women were desperate for. And so she was wanting the family name to continue. Verse 6 says, then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, otherwise I would jeopardize my own inheritance. So redeem it for yourself. You may have my right of redemption, since I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption and the exchange of land, to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another, and this is the way of confirmation in Israel. So the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. You remember that's the two sons, sick and tired? If you were with us in week 1, that's what their names mean. Verse 10, furthermore, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. So the name of the deceased will not be eliminated from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace. You are witnesses today. There's a contrast here. Do you see it? Do you see the contrast between Boaz and this random man with no name? You've got this man who is unwilling to do anything that's going to maybe jeopardize something that he has. He's unwilling to step into anything risky. And then on the other hand, you have Boaz, who's willing to sacrifice in order to care for someone that he's not obligated to care for. He's choosing. So you see this contrast here. That's significant. Continues on and says, and all the people who were in the court and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. And may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the descendants whom the Lord will give you by this young woman. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he had relations with her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. This is a significant moment in Ruth's life, Ruth and Boaz. Then the woman said to Naomi, blessed is the Lord. The women said to Naomi, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you one who restores life and sustains your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him. That's significant because what's the number of perfection in the Bible? 7. And having 1 son was significant, but to have 7 would be perfect in this sense. And she's saying, this daughter-in-law who loves you is better than your 7 sons. What 7 sons would be? Verse 16, then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. And the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram, and Ram fathered Amminadab. And Amminadab fathered Nahshon, and Nahshon fathered Salmon. I'm going to go with Salmon. And Salmon fathered Boaz, and Boaz fathered Obed, and Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. The end. End of the story. That's a lot. Throughout this entire series, we've been looking at this story, and we've recognized there's some significant things going on in the story. There's some powerful moments in the story that not only are interesting to listen to, but that we can connect our own lives to, and we can begin to make some sense of things going on in our own life from some of the things that are happening in the story. So Boaz is in this spot where, according to the law, he cannot become her guardian redeemer. There's someone else in line to do that first. And so what he does is he comes up with a plan to have this conversation, to make this proposal to the other guardian redeemer. And so he's sitting there at this gate. And I think we see a few things in the story. We see a few things for Boaz specifically that maybe we can look at and say, I need to make sure I have that, and that in my life if we want to experience a new chapter in our life. And the first thing I think we see is simply the providence of God. This is one of the major themes in all of the book of Ruth. You see the providence of God. I told you this a few weeks ago. There's not any major miracles taking place in the book of Ruth. There's no parting of the Red Sea. There's no one being healed from sickness. There's nothing like that taking place. But throughout this book, you see the hand of God at work. He's working and he's doing things as his people are doing what he's called them to do. We see the providence of God. What is the providence of God? Let me give you a basic definition for that. When God uses natural circumstances to bring about his supernatural will. That is the providence of God. We see this all throughout this book. We see it in verse 1 of chapter 4. When Boaz, it says, now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. Well, it just so happens as Boaz is sitting there, this no-name guy, we'll just call him Mr. No-Name, just happens to come walking by. I think we see the providence. This is an example where we see the providence of God taking place. Boaz is in the right place at the right time. And a lot of times we look at situations like that and we think, man, what a coincidence. I can't believe that the timing lined up just like that. And so they discuss the deals. It's interesting because the word and what this is actually written as in the original text in the Hebrew is when they're talking about this guy that we don't ever get his name. It's actually this word, 2 words, Ploni Almoni, which means no name. So we have literally Mr. No Name. Actually, it means a muted name. So we have Mr. No Name, and for some reason, we don't get the name of this person. I think we find that out as we continue on. But it says, behold. Remember back in chapter 2, if you were here that week, we talked about the first week in chapter 2. We talked about how it just so happened, as Ruth was in the field, that Boaz showed up. It just so happened. It could be seen as just a coincidence, but I think what we see here is we see God's providence. Mr. No Name just happens to be passing by the exact time that Boaz is there. He passes by. God is using natural circumstances to bring about his supernatural will in Boaz's life, in Ruth's life, and in the lives of those around them. So what do you need in your story to experience a new chapter? We need the providence of God. Every single one of us need that. We need to see him working. In the Hebrew, this is called, the way this is described in Hebrew is the word hashgacha pratis. Hashgacha pratis. And if I was to show you the actual Hebrew word written in Hebrew, you wouldn't know what it said. But what I know about Hebrew, and Birdie knows this because Birdie studied this even more than I have, to read Hebrew, you actually read it backwards. You don't read it left to right, you read it right to left. So you read backwards in order to understand Hebrew. As I think about this word hashgacha pratis, which is the Hebrew word for the providence of God, the only way that you can discover that word and know what that is by reading it backwards, which I think is the way we begin to see the providence of God. I think we best understand the providence of God when we begin to read backwards. We begin to look backwards. We begin to go back from where we are right now and begin to see where he was working through the natural circumstances, natural decisions that we experienced in our lives. You think about the rearview mirror as you're driving. Nobody just ignores the rearview mirror, but there's value in it. Even though you're looking ahead, you're looking out this huge windshield, there's this small mirror there so that you can see behind you. As I was thinking about that, I was like, that's kind of what we're doing, is that we're moving forward. We're continuing to be who God's called us to be, but we have this view, this glimpse of what's taking place behind us, so that as we're able to glance back and see him working behind us and see him working through the circumstances in our life up to this point, it empowers us to continue to move forward. It's important for us to understand what's going on here. So what I want to encourage you to do, maybe an action step for you this week as you process what we've talked about this morning, is I want you to consider taking 10, 15 minutes this week. Because maybe you've never done this. You've maybe heard me talk about I like to journal. I like to write down my thoughts. You can call it a diary if you want to. I'm not offended. But I enjoy writing down my thoughts and going back and seeing how God has answered prayers, and writing out my prayers sometimes and having no idea what things are going to look like, and then seeing over time how God began to work through those things. And so what I encourage you to do this week is just spend 10 or 15 minutes and just begin to look back at your life. Look back at some of the circumstances. And then begin to look back and see, where was God working in that? What did God orchestrate from that? What became possible because of that situation or because of that decision? Maybe it was, had you not have applied for that job, then you wouldn't have experienced this, or you wouldn't have this. If you hadn't introduced yourself to this person, then you would have never had this opportunity. Or maybe it was you not choosing to do something that allowed you to have an opportunity for something even better. But I think there's a lot of value in just taking some time to think back on, where have I seen God work through some of the circumstances and situations in my life? I asked my mom if I could share this morning, and going all the way back to, I'm not going to give a date because that exposes everybody's age, and I don't care about mine, but you're not supposed to tell a woman's age, so I'm not going to do that to my mom because she's here today. But my mom was in a relationship for a while, and it wasn't the healthiest relationship, and she ended up, that relationship fell apart. It was no longer a relationship, and shortly after that relationship ended, she discovered that she was pregnant, and she was pregnant with this guy. And so here she was, pregnant, single, probably really nervous and really struggling and terrified, and she had a choice to make, and that's not an easy choice. She had a significant decision to make, and obviously she chose to be my mom, and I'm forever grateful for that. And shortly after that, she met a man named Bruce, who became my father, chose to be my father, and together they ended up getting married before I was even born, which is crazy. That's, I think, God's providence at work in natural circumstances. And they got married, and they ended up moving to a small town called Van Horn. And in Van Horn, they began to attend this small town church and began to understand more of who Jesus was and grow more in their faith, and then had 2 more kids. And so me and my brothers began to grow up in this church, learning about God, understanding God's love for us, and building relationships with other people. And all 3 of us, through that, we began to understand faith for ourselves and became followers of Jesus on our own, because my parents had kind of led us to that. They had pointed us to Jesus. And so we, not only did we know Jesus, but we knew other people who knew Jesus. And it was a lot of great things that happened because of that. And then before I graduated, I decided I want to be a pastor because I met this guy named Jason Culverhouse, he's still a good friend of mine. And the way he loved Jesus and loved people was unique, and it was shaping the lives of other people. And so I just watched that and I was like, man, I want to live that kind of life, and I want to be a pastor. I want to jump into ministry. And so I remember talking to my pastor, and he said, man, I'm excited for you. I'm proud of you. I love for you to do that. He said, but don't just go to Bible college, which I thought was weird. I was like, what? Don't go to Bible college? Aren't you supposed to tell me to go to Bible college? He said, no, go to a secular school, go get a secular degree. He said, because there will always be ministry. There will always be pastoral opportunities. He said, but pastoral opportunities may not always cover the bills. And so he said, go get a secular job, because a secular company they're going to prefer somebody that has a secular degree over a New Testament degree. And he said, and then you can go to seminary. And so I did. I took his advice. I started school, and then I kind of fell out of school. I quit going and started working at Sam's Club. I was going to make it big at Sam's Club. Man, bring home the big boxes of cereal and all the crazy things you find when you go in there that you didn't know you needed until you saw them on the end caps. I mean, that's what Sam's is. And I loved it for a little bit, and then I quickly began to realize this isn't what I want to do forever. And then in the summer of 2002, I was invited to go to a youth camp as an adult sponsor. And as I went, like, my eyes were open again, and my heart kind of exploded for ministry. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew I needed to go back to school. So just through a crazy sequence of events, I ended up going back to school, moved to College Station because I wanted to be with my friends that I'd grown up in this little small town of Van Horn, going to church together, learning about Jesus together, loving and caring about each other. And we all went to school together at A&M. As I'm at A&M, I meet this woman named Brandy while we're going to church, and we're on a ski trip. You've heard me talk about that the last few weeks. She just happens to be going to the same seminary that I'm going to after she graduates from A&M. And I'm like, man, maybe this is meant to be. So we did. We both went to seminary and both got our master's degrees at seminary, and then jumped into ministry. And long story short, because that's a really long story already, here we are. And the reason I tell you all that isn't so you can be like, oh, wow, that's a great story. What I want you to see is, I think this is true for all of us. You can maybe go back in your life and you see pivotal moments, decisions that we make, or decisions that people around us make, whether it was my mom, my dad, myself, my brothers, and you see God's hand working. And it may not feel like he's working in those moments, but you can look back and you can see the providence of God as you look backwards and gain understanding on what he's done and what he wants to continue to do in your life. The providence of God is best understood when we look back. I think we can see the same thing if you consider Ruth's experiences in the earlier chapters. If we didn't have chapter 4, if this didn't move into the next chapter, then the title for Ruth's story up to this point might be Suddenly and Tragically Widowed. That's it, the end. Or Broke and Broken in Bethlehem. That would be the end of the story. But there's a better chapter. That's not the end of the story. And we see God's providence at work in her story. If it's not good, God's not done. I say that all the time, but it's so true. If it's not good, God's not done. If there's still air in your lungs, God's still working. Even though you may not see it, he's still working on your behalf. Boaz had the providence of God. But not only did he have the providence of God, he had a strategic plan. You're like, wow, Wes, that sounds real spiritual. He had a strategic plan. Boaz wasn't a pastor. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a missionary. He was a business owner. He was a business leader. And he had come up with this plan, not to go do a Bible study, not to go out on a mission trip, but he came up with this plan to negotiate a deal according to the law with Mr. No Name. And he came up with this plan, and then he began to carry out the plan. And as he did, God's in on it, because God's providence is combined with the plans that he's making. You see God begin to work in this. Boaz goes to the city gate. He calls these other guys in. Mr. No Name just happens to show up. In verse 4, it says, "So I thought that I would inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here and before the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me so that I may know. For there is no one except you to redeem it, and I am after you." And he says, "I will redeem it." So this guy says, "Yeah, that sounds like a great deal. This is like pennies on the dollar kind of deal. I'm all in for this." And right before the handshake, Boaz says, "Well, but there's something else." And he explains, you can redeem the land, you can buy the land, but with that, you also will acquire Ruth the Moabitess, which, by the way, she's a foreigner. She's not from around here. And I think I forgot to mention that her grumpy mother-in-law is also with her. And so I just want to make sure I throw in that little detail before we shake on this deal. And Mr. No Name's like, oh, yeah, no, you know what? I think I'm out on that thing. Which is fascinating because he begins to backpedal a little bit. And you see the difference. You see the difference in Mr. No Name and Ruth. All through the story, Ruth has taken risk after risk after risk. Mr. No Name shows up and he's presented an opportunity to care. He's presented an opportunity to invest, to provide, to do something that God has given him the right to do. And he says, that's too risky. I'm not sure I want to do that. While Boaz says, I'll take the risk. I'll commit to that. Not out of obligation, but because I care, and I care deeply for him. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, otherwise I would jeopardize my inheritance. Mr. No Name saw this and probably would have titled this too risky an investment. Boaz sees it and probably titled it, this is a story. And this is a story worth telling, where the script gets flipped. A new chapter has shown up. And then we never hear about Mr. No Name again. My fear is oftentimes we can find ourselves in the same place Mr. No Name is, where we're afraid to take a risk. We're afraid to do what God has called us to do. Yet we deeply desire to live a life and to write a story with our life that's worth telling, that's worth something. And we never really truly get to experience that because we never fully jump in. We're not willing to truly take the risk. Boaz is willing to do that. And he makes a plan for it. One of the most spiritual things you could do this week is to just make a plan. But whatever it is you're walking through, we have a tendency, if we're not careful, to not ever make a plan. We know a plan needs to be made, but man, we're busy. We got things to do this week, right? I mean, if I went around, every single one of us would probably admit, I'm really busy this week. I don't know that I have any extra time to do anything else. Boaz was probably a busy man. Look what Proverbs 21 verse 5 says. It says, the plans of the diligent certainly lead to advantage, but everyone who is in a hurry certainly comes to poverty. Plans are valuable. And it's easy to live every single day busy, 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 reacting and responding to the urgent, failing to pay adequate attention to the things that most desperately need our attention, the things that most desperately need a plan in our life, to live a story worth telling. And if we're not careful, where it leads us to, as it says, comes to poverty. And that may not be a financial poverty, but you find yourself in a place where you feel like you're lacking. You feel like you're missing something. And maybe it's not a financial means, but there's something missing because we've never made a plan. What are your plans? You think about your life, like what are your plans? Is your marriage struggling? If your marriage is struggling, things aren't good, what's the plan then? I'm not saying this to try to be a heavy hand, but what is the plan? Because if you want something different, we have to be willing to do something different. So do we invite some people into our life to begin to share some godly wisdom and some godly counsel? Do we schedule that counseling appointment that maybe we've been putting off for months or years? But what is the plan? What's the plan that we can begin to put into place so that we can break the cycle that we've been stuck in forever and begin to write a new chapter in our life as God begins to work in the plans that we're pursuing? Are you struggling financially? Do you have a financial plan? You're like, yes, Wes, I do. In fact, it's I spend more than I earn. It's a great plan. It's a lot of fun. What's the plan? Like, is it time to cut up some credit cards? Is it time to start the debt snowball? Is it time to do something different? Maybe it's health. You think about your physical health. What's your plan? Like, well, I eat and I sleep. And I kind of like that because it's fun for a time. And then your cholesterol starts going up and blood pressure is all out of whack and clothes don't fit like they need to, and because we don't make a plan. So what would it look like to make a plan? And to make a plan is to say, I'm going to do this. This is how I'm going to accomplish the results I want in my physical body. These are the things that I'm going to eat. This is the way that I'm going to rest my body. These are all God-honoring things. This is a spiritual process. If we want a better chapter in our next chapter, then maybe we should make a plan around some things that we've never made a plan for. You see this with Boaz. Boaz experiences the providence of God, and he has a strategic plan. So he works his plan, he buys the land, he becomes the guardian redeemer, the one who's going to redeem Ruth, who's going to provide for her, who's going to care for her, who's going to begin to help. He's going to marry her so that she can maybe have children again one day. In verse 10, it says, "Furthermore, I've acquired Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased will not be eliminated from his brothers or from the court of his birthplace." You are witnesses today. Boaz has a plan. He begins to execute his plan. Boaz has a chapter. Ruth has a chapter, and God is connecting their chapters to write a new story for both of them. And every single one of us have the same opportunity for the new chapter. I think the last thing we can throw in the mix here that we see all throughout this entire book, but even in chapter 4, not only is there the providence of God or a strategic plan, but there are faith-filled prayers. Faith-filled prayers. We see this throughout the book. Sometimes I talk to people, and I've had these same thoughts before in my life. When I think about prayer and I think about a really healthy prayer life, I get really discouraged because I'm like, man, I just don't pray like some people. Like you know that person who just, man, they pray, and when they pray, it feels like you're being elevated into a heavenly realm, because you're just like, I mean, you don't even close your eyes, you just stare at them because you're just in awe of the way that they pray. And then you hear about their private prayer life and how much time they spend praying and how early they get up in the morning to pray. And you're like, man, I could never have that kind of a prayer life. I found some encouragement as I think about the book of Ruth, because there's prayer after prayer after prayer throughout this entire book, and none of them are long prayers. If you were to ask me, Wes, how long do you pray? Not long. I got too much ADD for that. I'm like, God, so I was coming to you today and squirrel. And then like 30 minutes later, God, yeah, back to what I was asking for. What was I asking for? I don't even remember. Or I fall asleep, and you wake up in the morning, you're like, oh man, that prayer is not going to get answered because I didn't even say amen at the end of it. But I want to encourage you. I think you can pray without praying for a long time, but praying often. And you see this throughout the book. I mean, if you go back and you just kind of look for the prayers in this book, in chapter 1, verse 9, Naomi says, "May the Lord give you a husband." She has this prayer for Ruth. May the Lord, actually for Ruth and Orpah. Ruth in verse 17 of chapter 1 says, "May the Lord deal with me if I leave you." She's praying that about Naomi. Boaz in chapter 2, verse 4 says, "May the Lord be with you," as he's speaking to Ruth. The workers, his servants, they pray, "May the Lord bless you," in verse 4 of chapter 2. Boaz in verse 12 of chapter 2 says, "May the Lord repay you." Ruth in chapter 2, verse 13 says, "May I continue to find favor." These are prayers. They're expressing prayers. They're calling these prayers out. Naomi in verse 19 of chapter 2 says, "May the Lord bless the man who blessed you." Boaz in chapter 3, verse 10, when he wakes up and there's a woman at his feet in the middle of the night, he says, "May the Lord bless you." And then we find ourselves in verse 11 in chapter 4, and we find another prayer. "And all the people who were in the court and the elders said," here's the prayer, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel. And may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem." They're praying that she would be prosperous and famous. And they're pointing back to people from the past, generations ago, where they saw God's redemptive work. And they're praying from that perspective that God would do redemptive work in Ruth's life. It continues on in verse 12. "Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, through the descendants who the Lord will give you by this young woman." This is an incredible story. They're praying in anticipation of this. So Boaz and Ruth, they get married. Ruth has a child in verse 14. One last prayer. "Blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel." They're praying that Obed's name would be famous in Israel. "May he also be to you one who restores life and sustains your old age. May your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given birth to him." They're calling these prayers out. These are faith-filled prayers. This is an incredible story about the fulfillment of God's promises and the redemption of his people. And we can find ourselves in this story over and over and over, because the same possibilities that were there for Ruth are there for you and for me. I mean, just consider how the story started. Death, tragedy, loss, bitterness. Those are some of the things we read about in chapter 1. And then there was this glimmer of hope. And we find ourselves in chapter 4, where there's love, there's provision, there's new life. I mean, just compare Naomi in chapter 1 to Naomi in chapter 4 and what she's experienced because of the work that God's done in Ruth's life. Because not only does God want to do something new in you and me, he wants to do something new in you that does something new in those around us. Because the work that he does in us is never just about us. It's for those around us just as much. We see this take place for Ruth. It didn't just impact Ruth, it impacted the individuals around her, it impacted entire families, it impacted a generation. And we see the impact in the past, and we see the impact that shows up in the future because of Ruth and Boaz's obedience, commitment. Almost 3 years ago, in October of 2022, I was on staff at a church and just really started feeling, Brandy and I both just feeling like, man, I feel like change needs to happen. I'm just kind of feeling this tug, feeling this tension of maybe it's time to move to something new. Maybe it's time to do something different. And in that, I was terrified because I didn't know what different was. And it also seemed kind of crazy because everything was easy. Things were easy. We were provided for. It was safe. It was comfortable. And as time went on, just continued to start feeling more and more of this pulling us away, saying, maybe there's something different. I didn't know what that was. And I think that was the most difficult part. That was the most frustrating part. It's because when you feel like God is calling you to do something, or he's pulling you away from something, or he's telling you, hey, that doesn't need to be a part of your life anymore. That's great if he tells you what's taking its place. But that wasn't the case for us. And it was frustrating because I wanted clarity. I wanted confirmation. And it just wasn't there. And so the greatest confirmation I received was finally when Brandy said, no, I think it's time to go. And I was like, okay, if she thinks it's time to go, it's definitely time to go. And so we prayed about it. And so I resigned from my position. And it was a very strange, bizarre thing because it was terrifying, but at the same time, there was a peace in it. Because when you begin to do what God's calling you to do, you will experience peace despite the anxiety and the nervousness that's going on in your mind and going on around you. And so in that time, we just started praying and asking that God would show us what was next. And I think as we began to step away from what was and started looking towards what was next, things began to make more sense. Things became more clear over the weeks to come. And I remember one night we were sitting at dinner with some friends at Alicia's, and as we're sitting there, I think is the manager of the place, walks up and he hands me a note and he says, hey, y'all's meal is taken care of. All of us, our friends, ours, everything. He said, y'all's meal is taken care of, and here's a note. And I was like, who did this? And he's like, they were sitting right over there. Well, I didn't notice who was sitting over there. They were already gone. And I opened up the note, and it makes my hair stand up even telling the story. We've been sitting there talking about what's next. What are we going to do? And kind of dreaming, kind of throwing out these random ideas and thoughts, and open up this paper, and it goes this short statement. He just said, man, you baptized me several years ago when I was a high school student, and I got to be a part of your student ministry. And he said, I went off to college and God began to get a hold of my life, but my life, the direction of my life changed during my time in high school while I was part of the ministry that you were leading. And the last thing he said, don't stop doing what you're doing. And I was like, are you kidding me? And I was just like, the timing just so happens, right? It just so happens. Or maybe it's God's providence at work in the natural circumstances going on in our life. And so we just continued to pray, and over time, things became more and more clear, and we started jumping in and making plans to start a church. Seemed crazy. And I'll be honest with you. I hope I'm always honest. I don't even know why I have to say that, but maybe it's more of, you may not believe me when I say this because you don't expect me to say this, but I honestly, as I was moving forward and everything was exciting and people were excited and we started praying and we started kind of thinking through these plans, there were parts of it that I hated. I hated it because I wanted more clarity. I wanted to know the details. I wanted to know how it was going to work. What was going to happen? What were the results going to be? I remember there was a conversation I had shortly after we decided to start Church Story, and there was a group of us that just started getting together and praying about this, and we were about to start having, I think it was the day before we had our very first interest gathering, and I was sitting at lunch with a pastor of a local church in the area, someone I greatly respect, and who was honestly a great voice in my mind during those days, and he had a conversation with me about potentially coming on staff and being the executive / teaching pastor at this church. And I remember leaving and I told him no. I was like, because I'd already told him about the church. He's like, well, great. I guess that tells me what my answer is. And I drove away thinking, man, that'd be a lot easier. I even called Brandy and I was like, and it was kind of flattering, but at the same time, I was like, man, we could just kind of ease right in. I'd actually get a paycheck pretty quick. And it just seemed easy. And there were times I didn't enjoy that. It was difficult. I wanted to know what it was going to look like. I wanted to know how everything was going to turn out. I wanted to know that if I did this, then A, B, C would fall into place. I wanted to know that chapter was over and a new chapter had come. I wanted to just all be easy and to be safe. But it wasn't that way. We, not just Brandy and I, but many of you who are sitting here today, we just had to keep going. And we just had to keep doing what we knew we were supposed to do. And as we continued to do things, God would clarify for us and give us more clarity, but also provide. And here's what's fascinating is today I can look back at those critical moments where I thought there's no way. This is too hard. This is too difficult. And I can see, oh, I see it now, God. This is what you were doing then. This is what you were about to do. This is why you didn't let us do that or this or this. You see, we live in a mindset where we want immediate results and immediate answers. We want the microwave, not the oven. And there's not really anything good that's made in the microwave. Show me somebody who eats a lot of food that they make in the microwave and they're probably not very healthy. And I say that because I think that's true for us. We want it quick, but oftentimes when it's quick, we don't experience everything God wants us to experience that's going to mature us and shape in us everything that he wants us to experience because he's working in that. So I don't know what this looks like for you. I don't know where this lands with you, but I want to encourage you to not miss out on the next chapter that God has for you. He has a chapter for you. He has a story he wants to continue to write in your life. This is what the story of Ruth is encouraging us to. There's redemption available for every single one of us. It's possible for you, regardless of where you come from. The providence of God is working even when you can't see it. God has a plan. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Jesus goes to the cross and he gives his life, the perfect, spotless, without sin sacrifice to pay the penalty for my sin, for your sin. And then God raised him from the dead on the third day. God had a plan. And when you begin to look at God's plan, you begin to reflect back on the providence of God, it's best understood when you begin to look backwards. So let's look backwards for a second. Because before Jesus died on the cross, before he rose from the grave, what did he do? He prayed. Tetelestai, it is finished. Into your hands I commit myself. He prayed. He prayed in the garden. People were praying. Why? So that anyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Not just some, but anyone. Regardless of who you are and where you've been. God had a plan. 2 Timothy 1:9 says, God saved us and called us with a holy calling, not according to our works, but according to his own purpose and grace, which he granted to us in Christ Jesus from all eternity. He had a plan. And if you keep looking backwards, Jesus lives this perfect life, sinless life. He's born to the Virgin Mary. You see the providence of God working. And as best understood, you continue to look back. If you go to Matthew chapter 1, starting in verse 16, and you begin to work backwards through the genealogy of Jesus. Jacob fathered Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So if we begin to Go backwards. Mary was engaged to Joseph, whose father was who? Jacob. Look. Mary, Joseph, who came from Jacob, who came from Mathan, who came from Eleazar, who came from Eliud, who came from Achim, who came from Zadok, who came from Azor, who came from Eliakim, who came from Abiud, who came from Zerubbabel, who came from Shealtiel, who came from Jehoiakim, who came from Josiah, from Ammon, from Manasseh, Hezekiah, Ahaz, who came from Jotham, who came from Uzziah, from Jehoram, from Jehoshaphat, from Asa, from Abijah, from Rehoboam, from Solomon, David, who came from Jesse, who came from this little boy named Obed, who came from Boaz and Ruth, who, by the way, Boaz was the son of a prostitute, Rahab the prostitute. And so you have Boaz, who was born from a prostitute, and Ruth, who was a Moabitess, a foreigner. And from there is the lineage of the Messiah. You see, the providence of God is always best understood when you begin to look backwards. You begin to read backwards. Think about your next chapter. And think about this, and I'll close with this. Last week I said, DTR. Over and over and over. And you just went along with it. And I never said what DTR means. And so all day Sunday I get text messages and DMs. What is DTR? And honestly, I really thought more people would know. But you don't. I mean, I heard some people say it means down to ride. It means deep, thoughtful relationship. Determined to run. What does it mean? It means define the relationship. So I'm going to ask you again, like I did last week. When it comes to Jesus, who is he to you? Who is Jesus to you? When you define that relationship, is he just some guy that you kind of like? That you're somewhat committed to when it's convenient? Or is he Lord? Is he Lord God? Because he did what he did. He pursued us because he wants to be Lord. He wants to be your Savior. He wants to be your Messiah. And my fear is there's a lot of us who we just show up and we go to church when it's convenient and we know who Jesus is, but it's more of a head knowledge and not something that exists at the core of us. Our life doesn't revolve around him. The problem is about 18 inches from our head to our heart of not knowing him as Lord. Because he didn't do what he did. He didn't give his life so that we could be religious. He didn't give his life so that there could be a bunch of rules, so that we could just join a church. He gave his life so that we could experience freedom. He gave his life so that he could help you write a new chapter in your life. But it takes trust. It takes knowing him and letting him know you, letting him be involved in all of it. And you're like, I got to get cleaned up first. No, you don't. You just come to him as you are. He'll start to rework. He'll start to clean you up as he writes a new chapter in your life. So where does that land for you? What decision maybe needs to be made? What plan needs to be thought out? What prayers need to begin to get prayed in your life? We're going to baptize today, and I'm not going to make this long, drawn out moment, but I just want you to consider where does it sit with you and Jesus? Is he Lord? Is there a real relationship there? And if there is, are you taking the steps? Are you walking the journey with him? Or is it just a moment? Because I don't think that Jesus gave his life so there could just be a moment. He gave his life so that it could be a relationship, a journey that we begin to go on with him, to experience him in everything that we do. And if you've never made that decision, maybe today's the day you make that decision. And you take that first step in that journey and get baptized. That's what baptism is. It's just a declaration. It's a symbolic declaration to say, I have trusted Jesus. I'm making an outward expression of an inward decision to trust Jesus and to give him my life and to live for him. And we're going to lose our minds. We're going to celebrate that today. Many of you have already chosen to do that. You've already registered. And so I'm going to pray. And as soon as I say amen, if you're planning to get baptized today, you can go ahead and head out those back doors. You can start getting changed and get ready, and we're going to all meet you out there in just a second. But if you didn't show up today planning to get baptized, but maybe today you realize for the first time, I need to give my life to Jesus. Man, what a great day to give your life to Jesus and go ahead and take that first step that he's called us to take. Or maybe you've given your life to Jesus, but you've never taken that step, and today's the day that you take it, because maybe you've been waiting on God to work, but God's been waiting for you to move. So maybe today that's your first move. We have everything you need. You can just walk out those doors and follow everybody else, and they'll take you back to where the clothes and the towels and everything you need. If you didn't show up planning to get baptized, we'll take care of all that. Let's pray.